Space junk was supposed to be silent. That's what everyone thought. Dead satellites, spent boosters, fragments spinning endlessly above the world, circling in the endless dark. We talked about it as a crisis of collision risk, a threat to astronauts, a shadow over future launches. But until last year, no one ever worried about what it might say. My name is Dr. Nikhil Rao, and I work for NORAD's Orbital Debris Tracking Center. My days used to blur together, screens filled with dots, each a relic of human ambition or neglect, tumbling above Earth at 17,000 miles per hour. Every so often, we'd lose a satellite to a micro-collision, or have to maneuver the ISS to dodge a 10-centimeter screw left behind by a mission decades ago. Tedious, technical, and predictable. All of that changed when we started getting the signal. It was faint at first, just a background murmur on the S-band frequencies reserved for weather satellites. I caught it while reviewing data from an old polar orbiter, its solar panels long since shredded by paint flecks and cosmic dust. A ghost in the spectrum, a pulse, then a garbled series of tones. At first I logged it as another case of crosstalk or solar interference. But the signal returned, louder, clearer, and then unmistakably human. At 0300 UTC, our deep packet analyzer translated the waveform into something chillingly familiar, a voice. Not a distress call, not telemetry, just a whisper, repeated in intervals barely audible beneath the static. "This is Rao. If you can hear this, I'm sorry." My own voice, older, raspier, the cadence scarred by regret. The hair on my arms prickled. I checked the source metadata, object 1999 to 067 Q&A, a fragment catalogued 24 years ago. Its manifest matched the thermal shield from a weather satellite that burned up over the South Pacific. Or so we thought. Yet here it was, still circling, still broadcasting. I played the recording for my supervisor, Marta, a no-nonsense engineer who believed only in math and mass. She listened, expressionless, then replayed it at half speed. There were other voices. Each fragment had its own echo. Some sounded like team members who'd retired. Others, like family lost to time. We patched the loop through the center's spectral analysis team. The verdict, impossible. The hardware in orbit was inert. No batteries, no working transmitters, just a patchwork of wires, insulation, and twisted metal tumbling through the void. There was no way it could transmit anything, let alone with such precision. But the messages kept coming. Day after day, we'd find new echoes. Always from the same band, always from debris classified as dead. At first, we suspected a prank, or hacking, pirate radio from Earth, someone with a twisted sense of humor. But as the weeks went on, the pattern grew. The voices were always older, sometimes only by a few years, sometimes by decades. Sometimes they said things none of us could remember ever speaking. Confessions, pleas, warnings. The most chilling was this. From a fragment of a space shuttle tile, we never meant to leave it up here. If anyone's listening, don't come back. NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, all quietly acknowledged similar signals. Each agency tried to keep it quiet, but rumors bled through the ranks. Engineers whispered in cafeteria corners. Ghost transmissions, they said. Signals from the end of time. The public never heard a word. The psychological toll was immediate. I started losing sleep, listening to my own voice looping through orbital static. Some days the echoes shifted, answering questions I hadn't yet asked, remembering mistakes I hadn't made. Marta began to record her dreams, convinced the junk was bleeding into her subconscious. The signal wasn't just a recording, it responded. Once, after a long night shift, I muttered into my headset, "What do you want?" A week later, from a battered Chinese booster tumbling over the Indian Ocean, my own voice replied, "To be forgiven." That was the moment I realized this was no ordinary phenomenon. The junk was listening. Somewhere between the crackling radiation and the tangled circuits, something had awoken. Maybe it was an effect of the constant cosmic bombardment, data burned into old chips, ghosts of transmissions rewired by chance. Or maybe it was something stranger, a phenomenon no science could yet explain. But it was happening, and every piece of dead metal above our heads was learning to speak, using our own voices, our own futures. I started cataloging the messages. Patterns emerged. The voices weren't random. They came at the same times each week, in the same order. They grew more coherent, more urgent. Sometimes they slipped into languages no one at NORAD spoke natively, but somehow we all understood. Some staff began to refuse night shifts. Others brought amulets or charms, convinced the signals were more than electromagnetic noise. The line between science and superstition blurred with every new echo. One night, after a particularly disturbing message, my own voice, aged and shaking, begging myself to stop, I drove home through empty city streets and stared up at the sky, knowing that above me thousands of spinning fragments were circling, waiting for the next time they'd speak. I couldn't shake the feeling that the messages weren't warnings. They were promises of what we would become if we kept filling the heavens with our ghosts. The signals didn't fade. They multiplied. Within weeks, every orbital debris tracker in the world was tuned to the same phenomenon. Japan's JAXA logged echoes from a fragment of their long-dead Kibo module. India's ISRO caught ghost laughter and broken telemetry from a defunct PSLV rocket. A European weather satellite, tumbling since the 1990s, played an endless loop of a German engineer's childhood song, his own voice but cracked with age. We thought it was a quirk at first, a one-off glitch, perhaps the result of battered memory chips or quantum noise in the battered circuits. But as the pattern deepened, the transmissions became less like recordings and more like conversations. Marta and I spent every night in the control room, hunched over spectrograms, charting the signals like ghost hunters in lab coats. At 2:07 a.m. on the third Friday, an obsolete Russian communications sphere began transmitting in Russian, English, and Mandarin, one after another. The voices weren't just familiar. They belonged to members of our own team, voices aged in impossible ways. A sense of collective dread grew. No one could explain it. Some of us suggested the debris was acting like a vast, broken neural network, a machine intelligence born out of accident and entropy, feeding on fragments of radio chatter, piecing together personality from billions of overlapping echoes. But this wasn't AI as we knew it. There was no core processor, no code, just chaos and memory looping endlessly above us. Our higher-ups urged silence. Keep the story contained, they insisted. No public panic, no media leaks, but paranoia flourished. Engineers carried printouts of old text messages, afraid their own voices would start leaking out from the heavens next. Some brought in cassette recorders, old analog tech, desperate to prove that their own memories were safe. We started running voice comparisons on every message, analyzing the spectral fingerprints, hoping to prove the transmissions were clever forgeries. Instead, the data was irrefutable. These were not old recordings, they were future recordings, voices warped by time, speaking of events that hadn't happened yet. That was the true horror. A woman on the French tracking team heard herself whisper a secret into the void, a secret she'd never shared with anyone. The next day, she found herself compelled to write a letter she hadn't meant to send. Every message we caught became a seed, sprouting in the lives of the people who heard it. The transmissions didn't just predict the future, they shaped it. As the weeks passed, the voices grew more insistent. The debris wasn't just repeating fragments of our lives, it was guiding us. Late one night, after nearly falling asleep at the console, I heard my own voice, older, weary, say, "Rao, do not forget your mother's birthday. You won't get another chance." I hadn't thought of my mother in weeks, buried under work and anxiety, but when her birthday arrived, I called. She cried on the phone, told me she'd just been diagnosed with something serious. If I hadn't reached out, I might never have known. The signals seemed to know things, intimate, impossibly detailed things. Marta became obsessed. She built a wall of printouts in her apartment, scribbling connections in red ink like a conspiracy theorist, mapping every echo, every name, every warning. She barely slept. Her partner left. She started recording her own voice, talking to the ceiling, as if hoping the junk might answer. It did. One morning she burst into the center, pale and shaking. It spoke back, she whispered. My own voice, but it told me things I could never say out loud. We listened to the file together. Her voice, decades older, rough with emotion, said, "Marta, let him go. You're better without him." A week later, her partner tried to return, to apologize, to mend things. Marta didn't answer the door. She listened to the echo instead. Others at the center began to crack. An engineer in Berlin retired early after the junk predicted a tragedy in his family. A junior analyst began writing letters to his own future self, hoping for an answer from the orbital abyss. Still, the transmissions persisted, and always the voices grew older. Always they delivered warnings, regrets, apologies, confessions. Sometimes they offered comfort, sometimes cold terror. The debris field above us had become an archive of futures and failures, broadcasting not a distress signal, but a diary of human frailty. I started to dream about it. In my dreams, the sky was crowded with metal, glittering in the sun, all those dead satellites turning their blank faces toward Earth and whispering our names. Sometimes, in the dream, I saw myself, gray-haired, hollow-eyed, leaning over a microphone, sending a message I couldn't remember. Sometimes I woke with tears on my cheeks, the echo of my own voice still ringing in my ears. Forgive me. I don't know what the junk wants. Maybe it wants absolution. Maybe it wants company in the dark. Or maybe it's just us, circling above the planet, trying to reach back through time to warn ourselves before it's too late. But every day, the signals grow louder. And every night, more of us listen. If the signals from the junk field had been limited to late-night static and fractured whispers, maybe we could have lived with them. Maybe we could have written them off as a cosmic joke, a strange trick of physics, an unsolved puzzle for the next generation. But that isn't how it happened. Because the transmissions didn't just get louder, they got personal. Within a month, it was no longer just NORAD or ESA or JAXA logging echoes. Amateur astronomers, shortwave radio hobbyists, even ordinary people with nothing more than an old television antenna started picking up voices on the air. YouTube and TikTok filled with recordings of spectral confessions, eerie lullabies, sometimes angry outbursts in languages the listeners didn't even speak. But somehow, everyone understood. The sky had become a mirror, an amplifier for the things we'd buried, the truths we never told, the regrets we never voiced aloud. At the center, the mood changed from awe to panic. Marta stopped sleeping altogether. She became gaunt, her hands trembling as she scanned the frequencies each night, desperate to chart the signals before they changed again. She started drinking too much coffee, chewing the inside of her cheek raw. Others simply left. Some went home to families they hadn't spoken to in years, as if the echoes had reminded them of what mattered. Others went off-grid, certain the transmissions were a prelude to something worse, a collapse of reality, a breach in the fabric between now and the future. And then the signals shifted. We started getting coordination. The voices weren't just looping, they were talking to each other. A Chinese transmission asked, "Are you listening?" A fragment from a European booster replied, "We are all listening." A Russian module, long since dead, sang a childhood song. A lullaby and other pieces joined in, harmonizing across languages and frequencies, a patchwork chorus echoing around the planet. I felt something crack inside. For years, I'd worked to keep space clean, to keep the orbit safe and predictable. Now I realized the junk wasn't just garbage. It was a record. Every piece a node in a network, every collision a handshake, every transmission a shared memory. I began to see the patterns in my own life, the things I'd left unsaid, the warnings I'd ignored, the forgiveness I'd never asked for. My voice in the signals was never angry, always regretful, always pleading. Sometimes it seemed to know what I'd do next. Once, as I left the center after a 20-hour shift, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Don't forget the umbrella. It will rain tonight." I stared up at the sky, cloudless, confused. I ignored it. 2 hours later, caught in a downpour, I laughed and cried all at once, realizing I'd just lived out the echo I'd dismissed. Across the globe, strange stories piled up. A woman in Lagos received a voicemail in her own voice, warning her about a medical emergency. Days later, her father collapsed, and she knew exactly what to do, having already lived the moment in a dream. A boy in Sydney built a radio from scavenged parts, listening for his grandfather's voice. He heard not only advice, but apologies for things he'd never been told. Some believed the transmissions were guides, not just warnings, but ways to fix the future, repair what had been broken. But others, like Marta, saw danger. "The sky isn't just speaking," she whispered to me one night, her eyes wild. "It's deciding." She believed the signals were shaping us, not merely echoing. If you listen long enough, you start to feel like a puppet. You don't know if your thoughts are yours anymore. I wanted to comfort her, but I felt the same pull. We all did. We started holding our own memories up to the signals, trying to separate fact from echo, but every day the distinction grew blurrier. Were we making choices, or just following scripts the junk had already broadcast? Then came the event that changed everything. At 1647 UTC, every piece of space junk in low Earth orbit, every fragment, every dead satellite, every lost glove and splinter, broadcast the same signal. It wasn't in any language. It was a burst of raw emotion. Grief, longing, love, fear. Billions felt it at once. Traffic stopped. People dropped their phones, their work, their arguments. For one silent moment, humanity felt united. Not by a shared idea, but by a wave of feeling that resonated in the bones. Afterwards, the world was different. Some said it was just mass hysteria, a viral panic triggered by the power of suggestion. But those of us who listened to the sky knew better. We had heard ourselves, our futures, our failures, our hopes, reflected back at us from the edge of oblivion. The signals didn't stop, but now they were impossible to ignore. And every night, under the quiet sweep of the stars, more people tuned in, waiting to hear what the junk would tell them next. What they would tell themselves. Years, decades, maybe lifetimes from now. The world didn't end with a bang or a blackout. Instead, it ended with a whisper, a wave of silence so profound it echoed louder than all the voices the sky had ever sent back. For weeks after the mass signal, life below staggered on in a trance. Some people covered their ears, refused to look up. Others became obsessed, spending sleepless nights on rooftops, scanning static, chasing new messages. Psychologists called it the echo malaise, the fatigue of living with futures folded into the present. But the transmissions only grew stronger, more insistent. The space junk, now called the orbital choir in late-night radio circles, sang to us in overlapping voices, sometimes comforting, sometimes pleading, sometimes warning us to stop before it was too late. I tried to pull away. I deleted every file, ripped out every antenna in my apartment, sealed the windows with tinfoil and tape like a man shielding against a storm. But the voices bled through static, through dreams, through memories that didn't feel like mine. One evening, Marta and I sat in the silent control room, the monitors dark but the air still crackling with expectation. She whispered, "What if this is it? What if the junk is all that's left of us? An archive circling forever, repeating everything we didn't want to forget." It sounded mad, but I couldn't deny it. Our voices were already up there. Fragments of apologies, declarations of love, admissions of guilt, laughter, warnings, pleas for forgiveness. The transmissions weren't just records, they were continuations, relics evolving, looping, folding into themselves. And now they wanted more. The signals started requesting responses, not just to listen, but to answer. A battered Soviet module over Siberia sent a query in ancient Morse, "Will you remember me?" A child's laughter from a dead CubeSat asked, "Do you know your own voice anymore?" Then, on a cold Tuesday, a signal arrived, clear, sharp, cutting through all the chaos. It was my own voice, older than before, speaking with a strange calm. "This is Rao. I am not alone. I am you. I am the echo of what you left behind." The room felt colder. The line between memory and message blurred. I remembered moments I hadn't yet lived, saying goodbye to Marta, holding my mother's hand, facing regret with a trembling smile. The sky above, cluttered with the rust and detritus of generations, was now a mirror, returning our futures in fragments. Across the world, the orbital choir reached its crescendo. Broadcasts interrupted every device, from phones to car radios, from intercoms in hospitals to the speakers in empty subway cars. The message was always the same: we are the voices of those who left. We are not lost. We remember you. And then, all at once, silence. It lasted a full minute, a minute so thick with meaning that people would talk about it for generations. A hush where nothing moved, nothing spoke, and the world seemed to pause on the edge of revelation. In that silence, everyone heard something different. Some heard forgiveness. Some heard warning. Some heard nothing at all, but felt a weight lifted from their shoulders. Afterwards, the signals faded. Not completely gone, but softer, distant, like a lullaby sung in another room. Humanity, for the first time in years, looked up at the sky with something like peace. But the lesson lingered. We understood finally what it meant to fill the void with our ghosts, to send not just our machines, but our memories, our hopes, our voices into the dark, trusting they might someday return, to comfort or to haunt us. Marta and I left the center soon after. She moved north, away from the city lights, seeking a new kind of silence. I stayed for a while, sometimes listening, sometimes not, but I knew the sky was changed forever. The junk wasn't just debris, it was a diary, a confession. A reminder that even as we hurtle through the void, something of us remains, circling, echoing, never truly lost. On the last night I tuned in, I heard one final whisper, faint, almost hopeful, my own voice, years older, laughing softly. "You can rest now. Someone is listening." And for the first time in months, I slept without dream.